It is our second video about learning and illness. And as we said before, one may ask about the relationship between illness and learning. He may ask why we relate illness to learning. It may be said that for no apparent reason you relate illness or disorder to learning, because learning is supposed to be a positive issue while illness is a negative one. And as we said before, who denies the connection between learning and illness consider learning only as a process through which we acquire new information or build on information previously learned. But really, learning means the alteration of behavior, the change of behavior as a result of individual experiences. So, according to learning, you can learn good behavior or bad behavior, normal behavior, abnormal behaviors, be positive habits or bad habits. So, the role of learning may be apparent in acquired disease. And according to the learning theories, phobias, for example, is one example of the acquired disease. Phobia, according to the learning theories, develops when fear responses are reinforced or punished. And although fear plays an important role in human development, adaptation, and ultimately survival. Although that fear can be disabling when it manifests itself as a phobia or an anxiety disorder. And as we said before, effective treatment for fear-based disorders like phobia depends upon the basic science that inform theories about the origins of fear and about how fear is learned. So, in our discussion in this chapter, discuss we will discuss some theories that may contribute to the explanation of phobia and give suggestions for treatment. So we'll cover some about the definition of learning, and already in the first video we covered some about this. What is the definition of learning? What is the difference between learning and maturation? What do we learn? Really, what do we learn? And how does learning take place? What are the factors that influence or affect learning? And as we said before, we can answer the last two questions. How does learning take place? What are the factors that influence or affect learning? We can answer these two questions by discovering the learning theories. Now, I would like to review briefly what we covered in the first video. We covered the definition of learning, and as we said before, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. It is not temporary one, it is a permanent change, and the change may be positive or negative. It is a change in behavior as a result of practice or training. What is the difference between learning and maturation? Maturation is a change in behavior also, but resulting from natural growth of the nervous system. So maturation is a prerequisite for training that function to take place. For example, walking, speaking cannot be learned until the relevant physiological and the neural components have matures. And all the changes in behavior which result from factors like as drugs, fatigue, damage to the central nervous system are not considered learned behavior. Why? Because they are temporary state of changes, such as changes that related to drugs and fatigue, or they are not temporary, but because they are not a result of training or practice, such as the changes that related to damage to the central nervous system. Also, in the first video, we discussed the answer of the question, what do we learn? And as we said before, we learn most of our behaviors. We learn abilities, skills, motives, attitudes, language, and even some personality traits. And also we learn some symptoms or acquired disorders. We learn good behavior, bad behavior, normal behavior, abnormal behavior, positive habit, positive behavior, bad habit, bad behavior, and so on. And also we discussed that we can answer the two questions: how does learning take place, and what are the factors that influence or affect learning, by discovering the theories of learning. And as we said before, we have to approach. We will cover two. We have many approaches, but we will cover two approaches in our discussion and in this chapter. The first one is referred to as associative approach, and according to this approach, learning equals habit formation, or to form an association between stimulus and response, or between stimuli and responses. And we have two examples of this associative approach. The first one is classical conditioning theory, which introduced by Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, and second one is referred to as instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning. It is introduced by Skinner. The second approach, or according to the second approach, the main question is how the brain processes or deal with the incoming stimulus or stimuli in order to respond to it. So uh, they emphasized the role of cognitive abilities, or other cognitive processes, other cognitive abilities, and their role on learning, such as thinking, understanding, memory, attention, abstraction, and so on. In our video today, we will move on to start with the first theory, which is referred to as the classical conditioning theory. So our topic today is classical conditioning theory. Uh, this we will discuss this theory in this video, and maybe in two other videos. Uh, Firstly, please, before mentioning anything about this theory, please listen carefully to what will be mentioned in this video.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собак.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
I hope you figured out from the videos the followings. Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused the saliva to flow. He routed the saliva ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps he thought the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex like a knee jerk. After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. His work started to run into trouble as his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine. They started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. At first, the dog dribbled saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat soon. A sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dogs salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food. Pavlov called this new response the conditioned reflex. Whatever the stimulus, his dog could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned even in the wild. Now, please watch it carefully again.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
Now, after watching this video, I think now you are qualified to know some about the classical conditioning theory. This theory, which played an important role in explaining phobia, and it had given us hints about the treatment of phobia. It is introduced by Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. Pavlov is a Russian physiologist. He discovered the conditioned reflex in 1912 and formed the classical conditioning theory. As you watched in the video, he carried out experiments. It is referred to as the classical conditioning experiments. The experimental subjects or experimental participants in these experiments were hungry dogs. He used learned or innate connection between the food and secretion of saliva. The stimulus is the food, the response is the secretion of saliva. According to the Pavlov's terminology, food, as we said, stimulus, Pavlov referred to it as unconditioned stimulus because it is able to create the response secretion of saliva, which will be referred to as unconditioned response. So food is unconditioned stimulus, It is abbreviated as UCS, unconditioned stimulus, and secretion of saliva as a response to the food is referred to as unconditioned response, or and abbreviated as UCR. And Pavlov was interested in number one, forming a new association between a new stimulus, for example, taking or sound, light, and the same response. And also, he is interested in seeing how an association between a new stimulus and the same response was formed. So, he is interested in discovering how to form this association, how to form this association between a new stimulus is not able to produce the response, and the same response is secretion of saliva, and in that case it will be referred to as conditioned response. So, according to the Pavlov's terminology, the new stimulus and the same response will be called, the new stimulus will be referred to as the conditioned stimulus, and is abbreviated as CS, and the same response in that case will be referred to as conditioned response, or abbreviated as CR. So we have some terminology, and we have to cover some about the Pavlov's terminology. Number one, UCS. UCS, as we said before, unconditioned stimulus. It is the natural stimulus. This is the definition of UCS, the natural stimulus, which is capable of eliciting a certain response without any prior conditioning, without learning experience. And you have to take into account, according to Pavlov, conditioning equals learning. So it is unlearned stimulus. The UCS is unlearned stimulus. For example, meat powder can stimulate, or food can stimulate salivation. The second concept in the Pavlov's theory is UCR. UCR, unconditioned response. What is the definition of UCR? It is the natural response to the unconditioned stimulus. For example, the dog's salivation, or the amount of saliva secreted in response to the unconditioned stimulus. For example, food. Okay, makes sense? Okay, the third concept is conditioned stimulus. What is the meaning of it? Is the new stimulus. It is a neutral, not a natural. It is a neutral stimulus that never elicited the saliva response before. For example, sound, light, ticking, and so on. What about the conditioned response? The conditioned response is the response to the conditioned stimulus. It is the same response, the secretion of saliva. It is the same response like as the unconditioned response. For example, secretion of saliva. But now it is a response to neutral stimulus, such as bell sound or light, ticking, and so on. Now, please look again at the four concepts, because you should be acquainted enough with the difference between the four concepts and the four abbreviations. We have UCS, unconditioned stimulus, UCR, unconditioned response, CS, conditioned stimulus, CR, conditioned response. What is the difference between them? According to Pavlov, the UCS is the natural stimulus which is able, or which is capable of eliciting a certain response without any learning, without any experience, without any conditioning or prior conditioning. So it is unlearned stimulus. For example, food can stimulate salivation without any conditioning, without any learning experience. But what is the meaning of conditioned stimulus. This is unconditioned stimulus. This is conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is a new stimulus. It is not the unconditioned one. It is a new, it is neutral. It is not able to elicit the response before conditioning, but after conditioning, it will have the ability to elicit the response, and in that case, it will be referred to as conditioned response. So it is, for example, such as sound, light. It is a neutral stimulus, cannot, never ever be able to elicit the saliva responses before conditioning. What about the unconditioned response? UCR. It is the natural response to the unconditioned stimulus. For example, salivation in response to food. What about the CR? The CR is the response to the conditioned stimulus. It is the same response, so the secretion of saliva, for example, but now it is a response to the conditioned stimulus, or the CS. Now the question is, how could this new association be formed? And you should remember that this theory add much to our understanding of phobia and how to treat phobia. And we will talk about this in the next videos. Okay, how could this new association be formed? We have four keywords. You have to take them into account. Number one, pairing. Number two, repetition. Number three, elimination. Number four, measuring. Bearing, repetition, elimination, measuring. Number one, by pairing the neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, the sound, for example, with a natural stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, for example, food. So we have to pair them. Look at this figure, please. So number one, we have to pair them. Conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So we have pairing, and you should remember they are quite different. They are not the same. The conditioned stimulus is the bell ring, and the unconditioned stimulus is the food. So, number one, pairing. And this for many times. So we have a repetition. So we have to repeat this connection between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus for many times. Okay. And you should remember that the unconditioned stimulus itself can elicit the unconditioned response, salivation. But the conditioned stimulus has no response, no salivation. It is not capable of eliciting the response. So we have bearing, repetition, and then elimination. Elimination means stopping the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. So we have to introduce the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So we have to stop the presentation of unconditioned stimulus. And then we have to measure the amount of uh, conditioned response, saliva, after the conditioned stimulus, and it was found to be increased as the trials progressed. Now look at this figure, and you have to remember we have four keywords: bearing, repetition, so we have to repeat it many times, and elimination, it means stopping the presentation of unconditioned stimulus, and then we have to measure the amount of conditioned response as a response to the conditioned stimulus. Look at this figure. We have conditioned stimulus, it has no response, cannot elicit salivation or the secretion of saliva. It is not capable of eliciting the response. And we have unconditioned stimulus, food. It has the ability to produce the salivation or the secretion of saliva, and then we have to bear them then for many times, so we have a repetition. Then we have to eliminate the unconditioned stimulus after this repetition, and then we have to measure the amount of saliva or the response to the conditioned stimulus. And in that case, it is the same response, but UCR and the CR, they are same. They are similar in quality, but maybe different in quantity, because of course the amount of saliva which is produced as a response to the unconditioned stimulus much be more than the amount of saliva that produced by the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell ring. Now, after this pairing, after this repetition, we can say that we reinforces the new connection between conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. Uh, Now we can say that through the conditioning or classical conditioning, the organism, either we are talking about human beings or animals, can learn to emit a natural response to an originally neutral stimulus, been able, which never been able to elicit it before. And in that case, we can say that the organism has been conditioned. For example, after the conditioning, the dog has learned to associate the bell ring with the meat powder and responded by salivation to the bell ring as well. Now, please watch it again.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool. Eventually, the dog salivated as much to the ticking itself as it did originally to to the presentation of food.
Полная. Идите сюда. М? Что я говорил?
He called this new response the conditioned reflex.
Собака.
Whatever the stimulus, his dogs could soon be conditioned to produce saliva. Pavlov believed that he had discovered how animals learned, even in the wild.
That's all in our video today. In our next video, we'll move on to more principles of the Pavlov's theory, conditioning theory. Thank you.